Ever feel like you're stuck on a hamster wheel? Like you're running and running, but going nowhere.
Oh, tell me about it.
Today, we're diving into some ancient wisdom that might just help us break free.
Yeah.
The Buddhist Four Noble Truths. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Buddhism.
Right.
Isn't that all about chanting and robes and
Yeah.
orange
I've
juice?
definitely got an image.
But trust me, this is about something much more practical. Understanding the root of that stuck feeling and how to actually escape it. We're diving deep into this fascinating text that lays out these Four Noble Truths. And it's not just theory, it's a toolkit for life.
Absolutely. And what's remarkable about these truths is how they cut through all the noise of our modern lives and really just offer this framework for understanding something that we all experience, suffering.
Yeah. The text doesn't shy away from that, does it? It dives right in.
Yeah.
The first noble truth, life is dukkha. Now, dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it's so much more than just stubbing your toe or, having a bad day.
It really is. The text actually describes dukkha as this fundamental unsatisfactoriness that's woven into the very fabric of existence. It's like that feeling of always reaching for something just beyond your grasp, that nagging sense that things could be better.
Okay, yeah, I feel that. Like you finally get that promotion you've been working towards, and for a hot minute, it's amazing. But then...
You're already looking at the next rung on the ladder, right? It's like the satisfaction is so fleeting.
Exactly, because even when we experience pleasure or success, it's impermanent. The text highlights how we crave lasting happiness, but we're seeking it in things that just don't last.
It's like trying to quench your thirst with salt water. It might seem like it's working for a moment, but ultimately you're just left thirstier than before.
Wow, that's a powerful image. Okay, so we've established life has its fair share of unsatisfactoriness, as you said.
At least.
Which leads us to noble truth number 2, right? The cause of this suffering.
Precisely. And the text is very clear on this. The root of dukkha is clinging, or tanha, which means craving.
Now, when I first heard craving, I was like, okay, yeah, I crave that extra slice of pizza sometimes. But the text digs so much deeper than that, right?
Right. It's not just about, craving material, things like that pizza. It's also about craving certain states of being, wanting to be liked, wanting to avoid feeling sad, needing that validation at work to feel worthy. It's all rooted in that same clinging, that grasping onto things we think will finally bring us lasting happiness.
So it's that feeling of, like, if I could just have that or be that way, then I'd be content.
Yes, exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. The text points out that this craving comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how reality actually works.
Oh, okay.
We believe that these external conditions, achievements, possessions, relationships can bring us lasting satisfaction, but it's a house of cards.
Because it's all temporary.
Exactly.
Like jobs change, relationships evolve, the new car smell fades away.
Right. And so the cycle continues. We get what we crave, and for a little while that craving might subside, but then it inevitably pops up again, focused on something new.
Okay, so life is full of this inherent unsatisfactoriness, and we're kind of wired to crave in a way that only perpetuates the cycle. Now, before you think this is getting too gloomy, stick with me, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. That brings us to, thankfully, the hopeful message of the third noble truth. Suffering can end. This is where things get really interesting, right? Because we're not talking about just like grinning and bearing it or pretending the suffering isn't there. This noble truth actually points to a way out of that cycle.
Exactly. And this third noble truth, it introduces the possibility of nirodha, that cessation of suffering.
Okay, but here's where I think some people, myself included at first, might get a little tripped up. Isn't nirodha often talked about as like reaching nirvana?
Right.
Doesn't that sound kind of unreachable?
Yeah.
Like you have to be a monk meditating on a mountaintop for 50 years to even get close.
It's a common misconception, and our source actually addresses that directly. Nirvana, it isn't some far-off reward or some blissful state that only exists after death. It's available right here, right now.
So it's not about like going to nirvana, but about realizing that kind of freedom from suffering in this life.
Exactly. It's not about becoming some emotionless robot. It's about uprooting the very cause of suffering, which is that clinging, that grasping that keeps us on the hamster wheel.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's less about saying, okay, I'm not allowed to want that new phone, which, let's be real, that just makes you want it more.
Right, exactly.
It's more about shifting from, I need that phone to be happy, to, it'd be cool,
Yeah.
but my happiness doesn't depend on it.
You got it. And this text reminds us, that kind of shift, that inner freedom, it comes from deep understanding and consistent practice. It takes effort, but the rewards, they're huge. Genuine liberation from that cycle of craving and disappointment.
Okay, I'm hearing you. But a part of me is also thinking, okay, but how do we actually do that?
Right.
Right? We've got the diagnosis, life has this inherent unsatisfactoriness. We've got the root cause, that clinging and craving that keeps us stuck. And now we've got this possibility of a cure, this nirota, this freedom from suffering. But, like, how do we get there?
That, my friend, is where the fourth noble truth, and possibly the most practical of them all, comes in. The path to the cessation of suffering. And the text lays it out beautifully. The Eightfold Path.
Ah, yes. The Eightfold Path. Now, I have to admit, the first time I heard about this, I was a little overwhelmed. 8 paths. That's a lot of
Don't
paths.
worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of it less like 8 separate paths and more like 8 interconnected aspects of one path. The path to liberation from suffering.
Okay, that feels much more manageable. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about, like, what's on this 8-part path?
Well, our source highlights a couple of key elements. First, there's right speech. This is about cultivating awareness of how we use our words, speaking truthfully, kindly, and in ways that are helpful rather than harmful.
So, like, being mindful of what we say and how we say it.
Exactly. Then there's right action. This one focuses on our behaviors, making sure that our actions are aligning with our values and aren't causing harm to ourselves or others.
So ethics are a big part of this path.
Absolutely. And this is where I think the real practicality of the Eightfold Path shines through. It's saying, look, if you want to experience less suffering in your life, and if you want to contribute to a world with less suffering, start by, cleaning up your own act. Start by living in a way that's ethical and compassionate.
That makes total sense. But those are just 2 aspects, right?
Yeah.
What about the other 6 parts of this Eightfold Path? This is where I start to get a little lost.
Well, there's right livelihood, which is all about finding a way to make a living that aligns with your values and doesn't contribute to harm in the world.
Yeah.
And then you've got right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. You start to notice a theme here.
Right effort, right mindfulness.
Yeah.
It sounds like this path is about more than just our outward actions. It's about our internal world, too.
Yeah.
Our thoughts, our attention. Like, it's about trying to be a good person, not just going through the motion.
You're getting it. And the text dives even deeper into that internal work with the remaining aspects of the path.
Right.
Understanding and right thought. It's about cultivating wisdom, awareness, and mental discipline in every aspect of our lives.
So it's like this holistic approach to living. Our thoughts, our words, our actions, our work, all interconnected. But there's no pressure to, like, master all 8 perfectly before you can move on, right? It's more about gradually incorporating these principles into our lives as we go.
You got it. It's a lifelong journey, not a destination. And that's where the text's emphasis on the Eightfold Path as the middle way really resonates. It's about finding balance, avoiding extremes of self-indulgence on the one hand and self-punishment on the other. It's about recognizing that we're all perfectly imperfect beings, just doing our best to navigate this wild ride called life.
This reminded me of something else this text emphasized, that link between suffering and impermanence.
Oh, absolutely. That's such a crucial point. The source explains how so much of our suffering comes from clinging to things that are constantly in flux,
It's like we're trying to hold on to water. The tighter we grip, the more slips through our fingers.
Yeah.
It's funny, this whole clinging to impermanence thing, it reminds me of this one time I was freaking out about this presentation I had to give at work.
We've all been there.
I was so caught up in wanting it to be perfect, terrified of messing up, and I just ended up making myself a nervous wreck. It wasn't pretty.
It happens. But it's in those moments when we're so caught up in our heads that another element of the Eightfold Path becomes so helpful, right? Mindfulness. The text describes this as like paying attention to the present moment just as it is, without judgment.
So like noticing those cravings, anxieties, thoughts, spiraling out of control, but not getting swept away by them. Like, oh, there's that fear again.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Exactly. You're creating a little space between you and your thoughts and emotions, so you're not so reactive. And from that space, we can start to make more skillful choices about how we respond to things.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I think it's time to bring it all back to what this means for our listener. Because let's be real, not everyone listening is about to shave their head and go live in a monastery, right?
And that's more than okay. That's not what this is about. The beauty of the Four Noble Truths is that they're not about becoming a Buddhist. They're about understanding the human condition, which we all share.
Yeah, that feeling of wanting things to be different than they are, whether it's wishing that traffic jam would magically disappear or, I don't know, desperately hoping that new relationship works out. We can all relate to that. It's just part of being human.
Exactly. And I think what the Four Noble Truths offer us is a framework for navigating those very human experiences with a bit more, wisdom and compassion for ourselves and for others.
I love that. It's not about pretending suffering doesn't exist, but about really understanding its roots and recognizing that there's a path to liberation, not by escaping reality, but by engaging with it in a more skillful way. And that path, as we've been exploring, is the Eightfold Path.
And remember, it's not about being perfect at every step, but just about taking it one day, one moment at a time.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's one thing that really stands out to you that our listeners could take away and maybe apply in their lives today? What's one small step they could take on this path?
Well, as we were discussing right effort, it really struck me how often we direct our energy towards, like, resisting reality, fighting against the way things are instead of accepting them and responding skillfully. Like your experience with that presentation at work, imagine approaching it with right effort, not to force a perfect outcome, but to just bring a sense of grounded presence and intention to the task.
Ooh, that's a powerful reframe.
Oh.
So instead of getting all overwhelmed by the pressure of wanting to just nail the presentation, it's more about focusing on what I can control.
Mhm.
Preparing well, practicing, and then showing up as my best self, regardless of the outcome.
Exactly. It's a subtle shift, but it can honestly make a world of difference in how we experience those inevitable challenges life throws our way.
I love that. And, it makes me think about that saying, what you resist persists.
Mhm.
The more we try to fight against reality, the more stuck we often feel. But if we can bring a little bit of that right effort, that mindful acceptance to those situations,
It changes everything.
this has been such a rich conversation. I feel like we could keep unpacking these truths for hours, but for now, we're going to have to leave it there.
There's always more to explore.
To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of the Buddhist Four Noble Truths. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit life-changing. Remember, these ancient truths are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and as always, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.